Okay, everyone, welcome back for part two here of our Constitution lecture. When we left off, we're talking about checks and balances. Another type of check that the judicial branch has on both the legislative branch and also the executive branch is what we refer to as judicial review. Now, if you'll look for this power in the Constitution, the power for the courts to decide the constitutionality of a law or of an act by the president, you're not going to find it. Actually, it isn't in the text, but it's implied and is assumed in a very important court case called Marbury v. Madison. Now, I'm not going to go into the details in that case because it'll make you go cross-eyed, but just know this is the case that established the power of the judicial branch, namely the Supreme Court, to review the constitutionality of laws. All right, our third way that the Constitution limits tyranny is via federalism. Federalism, we're talking about power, governmental power. And in the United States, power is actually divided between several different governments. On the one hand, we have our federal government. So this is the president, House of Representatives, the Senate, Supreme Court, federal courts. But they share power with state governments like the state of Iowa, the governor, the Iowa House of Representatives, the Iowa Senate, the Iowa Supreme Court, and then also local governments like Iowa City City Council or Johnson County Board of Supervisors. So how is this power divided? Like I said, we call this federalism, division of power between federal and state governments. So if you think about it, you're really under the control of a lot of different governments. And there are a lot of different governments here in the United States. Does anybody know how many U.S. governments are there? Yeah, there's only one. If you got that wrong, I'm going to fail you. What about state governments? Well, 50 states, so 50 governments, right? Counties? That's a pretty tough one. 3,091. Iowa has 99. Why we couldn't just split that last one in half and make it 100, I don't know, but that's just how it is. Municipalities, so these are like city governments. There are 19,000. Town or townships, so these are like smaller towns or like areas where you have a couple of different towns incorporated together. About 16,000. Special purpose districts are, basically elected governments that deal with special things like soil and water conservation or airports or things like that, sewage treatment. There are 37,000 of those in the United States. It's really a lot. And finally, we have school districts like the Iowa Community School District, or Iowa City Community School District, rather, one of more than 12,000 school districts in the United States, all of which are probably shut down right now. So, in total, 89,000 governments in one country, 89,000 different bodies of elected officials here that are going to carry out all the things that need to be done to make the country work properly and efficiently. So when we talk about the federal and federalism, we're talking about the national government, the central government, the president, Congress. They are given powers that relate to concerns that the whole nation is going to have. Like government has to tax to be able to do certain things. Government has to be able to borrow money in order to fund things that it can't immediately fund with its cash on hand. Regulating interstate commerce, so dealing with issues of trade between states, immigration, coining money, currency, that's another one, running a post office, federal courts, declaring war on other countries, raising and supporting an army or navy. So the federal government does this in different ways. Of course, the federal government is the one that issues currency. Think how ridiculous it would be if the state of Iowa and the state of Illinois and Missouri all had their own currency. How would we figure out exchange rates across state lines? It would be unworkable. Of course, if you have you may know that the government has the power to borrow money. It has to do this all the time in order to pay for its bills, which it doesn't have the money for. And we currently have racked up a pretty enormous debt because of this. If you're working, you know that you have to file your tax returns and pay taxes on your income to the federal government, often state governments too. The armed services, the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, all under the control of the federal government. It's the federal government that regulates immigration, sets citizenship laws, issues passports, runs, of course, the federal post office and federal courts as well. So all of these powers are specifically spelled out in the Constitution, and we have a name for them. We call them the enumerated powers. Sometimes they're called the expressed powers as well. The Constitution specifically says that government can do this. Now, the framers also knew that, well, there's going to be things that they just can't foresee. New concerns are going to arise in the nation, and the government's going to have to be able to adapt to it. And you're going to have to make new laws to deal with those unforeseen changes. So they inserted this very special clause in Article 1, Section 8, we call the Necessary and Proper Clause. It basically says that Congress should have all power to make all laws which are necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. So necessary and proper, this has another name too. We also call it the Elastic Clause. What do you think of something elastic, like a rubber band? What does it do? Well, it stretches, right? So this clause allows Congress to essentially stretch its powers beyond just the actual written words of the Constitution. So things are not specifically delegated to Congress, but can be inferred from the other powers that are actually spelled out, are basically allowed. Like, for example, there's no law that says that government can, ban, or nothing in the Constitution that says government can ban the sale of, bazookas and RPGs to ordinary citizens. But Congress is given the power to regulate interstate commerce. And since things like weapons are traded over state lines and, manufactured by materials that come from different states, or go through the assembly process, often going across state lines, that is something that Congress can, of course, regulate. So when it comes to the division of power, all of the enumerated powers, or expressed powers, are under the control of the federal government, and all the things that they can justify under the elastic or necessary and proper clause, these are all federal powers. Everything else, that's left to the states. So state and local governments are given powers to deal with things that are more specific to their region. Every state in the United States, of course, has its own government, and every state is very different in its economy, in its geography, and in its culture. And so there are just different specific needs that state governments need to have the power to deal with, like, for example, education, police and fire departments, issuing driver's licenses, issuing licenses for marriage, or issuing divorce certificates, conducting elections, caring for roads and infrastructure, and dealing with issues of water and land use. These are things that typically fall to state and or local governments. Now, the 10th Amendment says that power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively. We know these as the reserved powers. So things that are not specifically given by the Constitution to the national government are reserved for the states. Here's another important aspect of the Constitution. This is from Article 6. The Constitution, the laws of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. Supreme law. We know this as the Supremacy Clause. So if there's a conflict between state law and a federal law, who wins? Well, it's always going to be that federal law. States cannot make laws that are going to contradict federal law because the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and so federal law is supreme. All right, that's it for part 2 here. Make sure you get your quiz taken on Canvas. Also, make sure that you complete your written assignment as well, and feel free to email me if you have any questions or concerns. All right, I will see you all next week. Have a good day.